I just want to thank all of you for your interest in and support of supplemental instruction, and let you know how very important what you're doing is and how much we appreciate it. Without your input, we really couldn't operate this program optimally. So we do the best we can on our own, but having you here to give us input, to give us ideas, and to help us move this program forward is amazing. I'm going to hand this over to Susan right now.
I'd love to introduce my colleague, Julie Collins. Julie is from the University of Missouri at Kansas City, and she has kind of done everything. That's kind of the mothership for SI, and she'll talk to us about that. But what I like about Julie is she's one of these she's like a BMCC person. She's kind of all hands on deck. She just kind of jumps in, but she has been at the top of that organization. So I think she's able to talk to us about organizations like ours who, began gently with SI and now are seeing, the fruits of our labor, and hundreds of SI leaders that have joined us over the years. So Julie, do you want to start now and, talk to us and give us, some of your experience? I know you have some slides. We're at kind of an interesting inflection point in our growth. So I think you come along at a good time so we can learn from you.
Well, absolutely. Susan, thank you so much. A couple of things before I get started, and I tend to see the positives in just about everything. So this may sound like I'm gushing. When I see positive with everything, I see like super positive with your organization and what I've come to know Susan a little bit over the last, I think 3 years, but pandemic kind of wiped out some communication between us. But just what I'm hearing in terms of how you've committed to SI, how you've grown SI, the fact that you have this advisory board. I told Susan, and it's going to sound like I'm not telling the truth, but it's true. I think establishing an advisory board, you have representation, you have a lot of different stakeholders coming together, learning together, talking about changes, talking about differences that you may have across your campus and so on. And so I think that's a really great structure, and I'm very honored to be here. As Susan said, I did just recently retire. You're either my last gig from my old job or my first gig of, I don't know, free consulting. I don't know. But I am representing the International Center, even though I did formally retire March 4th. And I haven't done a whole lot yet. So let's see what the world offers me in the future. But right now I'm just kind of enjoying life. But I did serve, as Susan said, as the executive director of the International Center for the past 5 years. Prior to that, just to give you a little bit of my background, I was a K-12 teacher. I was an 8th grade English teacher, so none of your behavior scares me today. I just want you to know. I have seen it all. You can put on a pig nose or throw things at each other, and I'll just be like, that's another day in the world. But I was an 8th grade English teacher, and then I went to the dark side of administration, and actually found out that I think I had actually more of a calling for administration than teaching, interestingly enough, or maybe found a way to do both. So I was in assessment. That was primarily what I did for most of my K-12 career, was being an assessment and data director. Interesting that I had a communications background. Assessment, how's that work? I think I just like to talk about numbers. So I love the data, but I'm going to go ahead and get started with some slides so that you have some content here. I am giving you information today that we include in our overview presentation within the full SI supervisor training. And I know we have at least one person who has participated in that. Have any others participated in the SI supervisor training through the International Center? Okay, so while this may not all be, it won't be new information for you, JC, but it may be new information for some of you. I will, just because you've been working with SI for a while, I think you'll see a lot of things that you already knew, and that should feel comfortable to you. There could be some things I say that cause you that cognitive dissonance, like, wait a minute, I didn't think that was something that SI was about. So those are things that'll be great to include in our Q&A. All right, let's see if I can move the slides forward. We can. Okay, well, I probably don't need to include this, but just as foundational information, we know we need academic support in our higher education institutions. We need to facilitate learning And we definitely want to improve graduation and retention rates. And I am pretty confident on your campus that you have seen the positive impact that SI and other academic interventions have had. The sad truth is, and it's down here in this white area here, that nearly half of college freshmen do not go on to graduate. So I know as a community college, your goal is to have students reach that level of either an associate's degree, some sort of certification, and or to prepare them to go on to another institution. And I have some data here that I'll show you in a moment that kind of addresses that as well. So here are, this is age old. You've seen this, heard it, Vincent Tinto, 1993 study. So very old information in terms of the number of students who actually graduate from their first institution, a subsequent institution, and ultimately about 43% back in 1993 when the study was conducted do unfortunately drop out. Sadly, that has not changed a lot. So here's some more recent data. This happens to be for six-year graduation rates, pardon me, for four-year institutions. So giving that extra 2 years in terms of how long financial aid would still be intact for those students. And you can see that for all institutions, we have a 62% graduation rate. That's very close, isn't it, to that 43% dropout rate back in 1993. And this data is from 2018-19, so it's fairly recent. So here's more relevant for your institution because you are a two-year institution. These are 3-year graduation rates. And again, graduation referring to completion, successful completion, whether that's certificate, associates, whatever that completion looks like for that particular program. And it's even worse, sadly. So 33% of students graduate successfully from those 2-year programs. And this is taking into account, these are, I've got very small subtext, but you'll be able to see it's from the US Department of Education, National Center for Education Statistics. So while these are not your data specifically, I'm certain that you do have data. Hopefully it looks better than this, but just the reality is this is what it looks like on average across the country. So we have all kinds of academic supports that we have in place for students. We have individual tutoring, study skills. We're kind of away from this remedial idea for the most part when we can be, but certainly co-curricular studies so that we can support students who may have deficits in their learning as they're coming to us. We offer workshops. We know that students often, social emotional issues are often the challenge. So counseling sessions can be something that we would consider as part of a student's academic support. All of these things, in case I forget to say it later, are very important. So when we train SI, we don't say SI is superior. You should stop doing everything else and do SI. First of all, SI will not work for every course. It will not work for every student. And so you want a well-rounded opportunity for students to access academic support in addition to SI. But I am going to definitely spend some time talking about how SI is different. So here are some challenges. So I just said that so that you would know, like, I am not in any way saying stop doing tutoring, it's terrible. No, it's not. But there are some challenges with other models. First of all, it's very difficult to identify students who are high risk. So as they come into our institutions, we often think, well, if we could identify all the students who had risks and needs, we would just provide them what they need as they walked in the door, and that would help them. But who is at risk? When we think about that, actually every student who enters our doors has the potential, sadly, for being at risk. And sometimes students who have had very challenging high school years for whatever reason, so they may look at risk, sometimes those students actually thrive in a higher education environment. So we really don't know accurately who is at risk as they walk into our doors. Services are expensive, not to say SI doesn't come with also a price tag and has to be funded. But when you think about providing one-on-one services, those are pretty expensive compared to a model that is intended for small groups. It requires time. Again, SI does too, but if you think about some of these other opportunities that we provide, those require time to identify and to remediate. And then also for many academic support initiatives, it is difficult to evaluate the effectiveness. So we don't know if it's that made the difference or if it's just one of the things that we did that made a difference. So I am going to move into a brief overview. Again, this may be like, yep, I got it for many of you. But again, some things might be like, hadn't really thought about that or did not, or was not aware of that. So just a little history. Susan asked me to incorporate a little bit of the history of SI. It's an interesting story. SI was created at UMKC in 1973. And you're like, well, how did that happen? Just somebody sat down and decided to do that? Well, what the background story is that the University of Missouri, Kansas City previously had been its own private institution. And it became, in 1963, it became part of the public school system, or the public higher education system of the University of Missouri. And that's when it changed to University of Missouri, Kansas City, which is a mouthful. So those previous practices of how students were admitted, with a very, very high bar for who would be admitted, and probably some pretty antiquated instructional practices, because the students who came were already bound to be successful no matter how you instructed. Those things began to catch up with the university. And the University of Missouri, Kansas City is still known for its health science programs. So dental school, pharmacy, medical school, et cetera. So we have these programs admitting more students of diversity, of various types, socioeconomic diversity, all kinds of diversity. And finding out, and I always kind of chuckle that it took 10 years to realize that retention was a problem, but it probably started to be identified sooner than that. But after 10 years, something needed to be done, because students were just walking in the door and not succeeding and walking back out the door. And this was not a good system. So a committee came together, and the committee, Deanna Martin was at that time a graduate assistant from the School of Education, and she was working on her doctorate. She was asked to be on the committee and had a very large part, as it turns out, in shaping what SI was to become. But the committee's considerations, they couldn't lower the academic standards. I mean, we never would want to do that anyway, right? But when we're talking about someone who is going to go on and be a dentist, we need them to know how to do dental work. We can't just say, you got an A, good for you, and send them on their way without the information that they would actually need and the skill they need to be able to be successful. Again, that would apply to anything, but particularly when we're thinking about people who are going to work on patients, we need them to really understand the content and material and be able to be successful. And money's always a concern, right? But it's never like, here's an abundance of money. As I understand it, there was a budget of $7,000 that was through a grant that was provided, which in today's dollars, today's dollars might be even more, but we always trained that it was $30,000. I'd say as of today with inflation, it's probably $60,000. But at any rate, they were given a small budget to be able to pilot something to see if we could be successful. And of course, the whole goal there that you see in the white was that they didn't want to lose students. The goal was student retention. So here's what the committee, but mostly led by Deanna Martin in terms of what she knew from her education background about what might work in terms of student support. The goals were to improve learning, improve student performance, and increase that continued enrollment and retention. And so here are the first pillars of the model. And that was another thing that Susan asked me to revisit in the presentation. Is what are those components of SI that make SI SI? So SI, student facilitated review sessions, you already know that because you're working with it, led by a peer student called an SI leader, preferably who's completed the course before and preferably with the same professor, but those are not requirements. So it can be any student who might be qualified to lead the session. SI targets historically difficult courses. So this is one of the things that we say SI isn't for every course. You really want to target the courses that you would consider on your campus to be of the most challenge to students. What is barriers to their graduation? Let's get into those classes. And the SI leader, as you know, sits through the class side by side with peers, demonstrates what it looks like to be a model student, also has that opportunity to work closely with the instructor and to take their notes, not just on the content as they're revisiting that content, but also they're usually taking notes that help them plan the session. SI is open to all enrolled students. So a lot of SI is about taking the stigma out of support. It's not an intervention that's for students who either self-identify or whatever way say, I need help. It's for every student. So if an A student who is already going to do a fair amount of studying wants the benefit of studying in a group, SI is for them. So it's for every student. It is regularly scheduled. So we don't move around the sessions. One of the things that really helps SI be successful is to say, SI is going to happen Tuesdays, 3:30 to 4:30, and Thursdays, 9 to 10. So regularly scheduled and communicated. Outside of class, so we've got the class environment, and then we have what happens in SI, which is an external function. It's outside of the class. It is voluntary. So this is one of those things that people ask sometimes, well, can we require, SI is really great. Can we require it of students? You can. There's no SI police. No one's going to say, nope, you cannot do that. But I'm pretty sure you're putting on your thinking caps and you're thinking about what are the challenges when you require students to attend. One, you have to make sure everyone can. That's kind of a challenge. Although with online, maybe you could record it, but then it's not really a session. Okay, I won't go too far with that. But require means that everyone must have the opportunity, which is sometimes pretty difficult to make sure can happen. And also, if you think about the SI leader in a session leading a session of required, like I gotta be here, that doesn't always make for the best session. So voluntary is preferred, and it was the original model. And then anonymous is another aspect of the model that sometimes gets some questions. It is not anonymous in terms of we put blindfolds on the students and they can't see each other, but it is anonymous to the instructor. And there are some really good reasons for that. Anonymous to the instructor, so that there's not, I'll just name some of the reasons why that is part of the model, so that there isn't either a stigma, oh, this student needs to attend a lot of SI. Gosh, that's too bad. Not that I think instructors would think that way, but maybe some would. But more often it's the other way, in terms of if you think about the data that we want to gather to see if SI is being effective. Sometimes there are those opportunities to turn a high B+ into an A as you're looking at a student's grades. Oh, did they attend SI? Yeah, let's go ahead. That student's really been working hard. Let's go ahead and have them fall into that A- category rather than the B+. We don't want any of that impinging on the data that we keep from SI. So there's just a couple of scenarios that can happen when it is not anonymous to the students. But I think students feel more comfortable in general knowing that their attendance or non-attendance of SI is up to them. It is not a function of the class, and it's not something that their instructor would know. Again, that can be, that is not a rule. It can be broken, and it will still be SI. It's just one of the things that we train and how the model was started. So those are components. As you also know, there are some really key stakeholders without which SI cannot happen, and kind of working from the foundation of this graphic up. Students are the foundation. It is for students. It is led by students, so they are essential to the model. Faculty members, incredibly essential to the model. That partnership that happens between the SI leader and the faculty, and not to mention what the faculty does, which is teach the content. That's most critical, because SI doesn't teach the content, merely reinforces and helps develop understanding around that content the faculty members are providing. The SI supervisor is incredibly important. I think maybe just because of a question that was asked earlier, I'm not seeing names on my screen, but I think maybe we have SI supervisor, at least one SI supervisor in this meeting. Okay, kudos. If you haven't applauded for your SI supervisor lately, let's do that. That's an incredibly difficult job to arrange everything, communicate everything, make sure that everybody is doing what they need to do. And that's a lot of work. And then our SI leaders, incredibly important student leaders that we value and love. So in terms of the targeting the classes, we want to look for those historically difficult classes. Sometimes we look for those required classes. So every student has to take algebra, college algebra, for example, for certain programs. A lot of times those create challenges for students who are not prepared to do that work. So that might be an example of a required class. Gatekeeper classes, as you're looking at data, what are those classes that are keeping students from moving forward in their studies? And I don't know why I'm hammering on college algebra right now, but that's another one that kind of falls in that category, right? Sometimes that's a requirement. You cannot move forward in your degree program until you master this content. Ooh, that's a toughie. And there are other courses as well. And so just a general rule of thumb, this is a starting point to consider. Certainly you have other, I'm sure you've already identified on your campus what your requirements are, but when we train, we say on our campus, UMKC's campus, we use a 25% DF or withdrawal rate as kind of a place to start. That would be an indicator that, yeah, this class is keeping some people from being, from moving forward. We got a challenge here. So maybe we can use SI for that. On some campuses, they set their bar much higher for whatever reasons as they look at their data. And on some campuses, people would say, gosh, if 10% are getting D's, F's, or withdrawals, and maybe they have a big budget too, but if 10%, we would want to put SI in. So again, that's a rule of thumb to get started. It is not a hard and fast number. One of the things, and I have that, as I told you, I have an education background. And so I absolutely, this is my favorite slide. I can spend way too much time on it. I'll try not to. But one of the things that SI does is really reinforce a learning-centered model rather than an instruction-centered model. So in an instructional paradigm, learning is instructor-centered. It comes from an expert. Learning in that case would be cumulative and linear. So everything I said to you already, you've cataloged it. You actually might, you're pretty smart people, but you know, everything we say to students, they would have it and it would build one on the other. They'd remember everything. That's just not real world, but that's kind of what an instructional model would lead to. And knowledge would be stored and delivered. So in that model, if I want to learn how to play the violin, I could open up a book, How to Play Violin 101. And as soon as I read the pages, I could play the violin. Probably not likely. Now, I'm not putting down instruction. You have to have instruction, but it's not enough in and of itself to ensure mastery or competence, right? So a learning-centered model is student-centered. We recognize that the student is having to take information, assimilate that information. And so it's an active, I love this term, it's messy. Learning is messy. Already, I hope actually that I've caused a lot of messiness in your brain. You're like thinking about this, thinking about that. Maybe you've jotted some notes down, things you're going to ask later because you're learning. You're not just passively sitting there watching me deliver information. And so that can be uncomfortable, but in a good kind of way, right? So learning is messy and uncomfortable. And in a learning-centric model, knowledge is constructed. So that's actually how we learn, is that we create. You know this, but anyway, I just love it. So each learner is creating that learning for themselves, and it doesn't look the same for each person. So SI really honors the learning-centric or learning paradigm of instruction. But there are also some root problems to overcome about how we approach education, especially in our higher education institutions, because students are very pragmatic. Now, pragmatic doesn't mean lazy. It can seem that way sometimes, like, are they there? Are they with me? Did they just show up and they're just sitting here hanging out? But being pragmatic means I'm going to be passive because I have this expert in front of me and this expert's going to tell me a lot of stuff. So why do I need to engage? I just will receive what that instructor tells me. And also a interesting problem to overcome is that in the presence of an authority, we tend to remain a little bit silent. So like I may have said something completely backwards already today. Sometimes that happens with me. But you all are like, well, I'm not going to question that because she's an authority. I don't know that happened actually, but you can see that your students, if you would say something accidentally completely backwards, might be hesitant to say, Professor Ty, I believe that you got that completely wrong. Like that, you have to have a really great relationship and a really strong student who feels very comfortable if they're going to challenge at that level. So we know these things, and so we try to avoid those already failed processes. In particular, SI works to break the dependency cycle. So all those things that I talked about help create a dependency cycle, passiveness, receiving, because there's the authority. I'm just going to receive information, and then also not wanting to question authority. That creates a dependency on an expert. So in a dependency cycle, and again, these are kind of exaggerated to make the point, especially with the little graphics here, but in a dependency cycle, which can easily happen in any classroom, there's an authority, there's the little people down there at the bottom, those little circles are people, little students, and the authority tells them the information. And then if it fails, so somebody asks a question like, well, I don't really understand, could you explain that again? Absolutely, great instructors are always happy to explain again. So they explain it again, maybe a different way. If that still doesn't seem to be, so there's a quiz and it looks like a lot of students still aren't getting this key concept. Instructors are very patient. Okay, I've told them a couple times, let me provide more examples. This is a really crucial concept. I really need to get it across the students. again, it's failed in terms of the students still, some of them at least still aren't learning it. It's not bad. Like if you routinely do this as an instructor, I'm not trying to say that's a bad thing. You're doing everything you can as an instructor to get the information across. But this is where SI comes in and really helps support. It really helps break that dependency cycle. In the SI process, as you know, the instructor is still critical. Remember, you were a critical stakeholder. Those of you who are faculty members on this call, you're a critical stakeholder in that we rely on your content expertise to tell the students what they need to learn. Like the content is yours. But we break the dependency cycle in the SI session. So over to the side, when you see that SI leader sitting there looking like he or she's just hanging out, they're not just hanging out, they're actually listening, but they've got the students working together, talking to each other, grappling with the material that's active and messy learning, and kind of listening for, okay, where are there still misconceptions? What do I need to have them do next? That kind of thing. So your SI leader looks like they're just sitting there, but they're actually staying out of the process of learning, which is important. They set the stage and then they step aside. And then before the students would leave, or at some point in that session, that leader is going to make sure, not just by eavesdropping, but also make sure that they check for understanding. That's one of the pillars. One of the things we train is check for understanding, to really ensure that the students leave the room, at least to the best possible, the majority of them getting it in a way that they may or may not have gotten. They're at the very least, they're reinforcing what they learned from that instructor. So inside the SI session, I've already kind of hinted at these things, and you know some of these things, but it is not tutoring. So it's not an SI leader walking around to each student. How do you need help? How do you need help? Let me help you. That's tutoring. We don't do that. And it is not relecturing. And this is where a lot of leaders struggle, because they became an SI leader because they got it. They enjoyed that content. They're getting it. So the tendency, especially because that's what students expect in a learning environment, is to be able to say, can you tell me on number 5? I don't understand number 5. Oh, let me go to the board and I'll just show you. Nope, we're not relecturing. That's the instructor's job. We need to get the students engaged with each other so that they can develop that understanding. So what the leader does then is facilitate. They have a plan and they facilitate that session and they organize the time. All of that to say, it's like, that took a long time to get to a definition, but we built up to it. SI is organized group study time facilitated by a near peer. And this is actually a photograph from a few years ago. So I'm like looking to see, yeah, fashion pretty much is the same. Student fashion looks about the same as it does now. But anyway, these are students in an SI session and they have the mobile chairs. We only have one classroom that's like this, but it's a super cool classroom because the students can really just move their chairs over by each other and have those small group discussions where they're actively engaged with each other, understanding the material. We know that students who study in groups learn 2.5 times more than those who study alone. The huge caveat though is if the groups stay on task. So I referenced earlier that part of an SI leader's job is a glorified timekeeper, making sure that they keep the time moving and appropriate, because they have to keep the groups on task. That is something that they do. They are cognizant of the time, keep groups on task, move forward when they need to, and make sure that everybody's going where they need to go to get to those really critical concepts. So we know through the learning paradigm, students construct knowledge. And so that is what the SI session allows them to do through social interaction, exploration, applying concepts, integrating concepts. That's what we strive to do in an SI session.
It's always great to hear about SI from the horse's mouth. So now we're kind of all on the same level playing field. And I think it's about the research now. What have you guys learned at SI International that might help us? And how can we apply what you've learned to what we're doing?
The research claims of SI, this is over a number of years, right? So SI was launched as a pilot in 1973. In, I believe, the early 80s was the first large research study that was conducted on its effectiveness, submitted to the Department of Education to be able to earn the status. That's when the International Center actually was a national center first, but they were able to get a grant based on the effectiveness of SI in the early 80s. It was validated by the US Department of Education in 1992 and then reaffirmed through a little bit more recent research, 2014, in a very large literary review study conducted by Dawson et al. And these are the claims. These have held through in every study that's been done about SI. 3 things. 1, that SI participants will receive a lower rate of D's, F's, and withdrawals, that SI participants will earn higher mean final course grades, and that SI participants will persist, re-enroll, and graduate at higher rates than students who do not participate. That has held out throughout time. Now, I'm going to show you data. If you're like, wait a minute, we have a class where that wasn't true. There will always be, there should actually, just because data is real and data is messy, there will always be some classes, some sections, some whole courses, some whatevers that are anomalies with that and that don't hold the trend. As you know about data, the more you have, the more valid it becomes. So as we look at data on a larger scale, these claims always do bear out. But when you're looking at a school level, you will likely have 1 or 2 courses or maybe sections within a course that 1 or more of these claims don't bear out. In fact, a lot of times you'll see one or the other. Like the students who participate in SI have higher mean final grades, but the DFW rate didn't come out. Wonder why that is. That's okay. Those are healthy. That's healthy data, healthy cause for discussion. Very, sometimes the answer is, well, SI didn't really work for this class for whatever reason, but usually it's just an anomaly in the data to talk through. I'm not going to really, I think you know this, there are benefits for SI leaders, faculty members, and institutions, but actually it's a good time for me to mention, to Susan's point about research, we just recently finished a collaborative, it's published now, and I need to get that information to you, Susan, if I didn't already, but there is a study that we've just recently published as a collaborative international group around the benefits for SI leaders. So the transferable skills that leaders are acquiring by being SI leaders and receiving the training that's provided to them and doing that work. Not surprisingly, but we were able to demonstrate through surveys and also qualitative interviews that students who were SI leaders definitely are finding the benefit in their future, whether that's graduate school, if that's where they were when they answered the questionnaire, or whether it is their future career. They're definitely seeing those benefits. There are benefits for faculty as well. And again, all of these, I don't have like the studies listed. I do have a page that is a resource page or a reference page that I can definitely provide. But there are studies on all of these things. A great place to go to look for SI research would be David Arundale's. He has a peer learning bibliography on a site that he maintains. He's retired as well, but he's an emeritus professor at University of Minnesota. And he'll actually be at our conference as well that's coming up in June. That's beside the point. But anyway, he's done a great job of compiling like all kinds of peer learning research. And so just about any topic that you're interested in seeing what has been researched, what are the findings, you can find through David Arundale. It's Arendale if you're not familiar with David's work. Or Dr. Arundale, I should call him, but he's a super nice guy, and lets me call him David. He's a gem. But anyway, so there are benefits for faculty. Hopefully you're experiencing these if you're a faculty, that students are actually not only understanding the material better and performing better, which is something that you would definitely want them to do, but somehow it kind of makes them more confident learners. And so as they're coming back to your class, they're more likely to engage and ask questions, we hope. Those kinds of things. And also getting that relationship with the SI leader is a feedback loop when you have the best relationship possible, and that doesn't happen every term or with every leader, right? It doesn't always happen. But when you have that really great communication going on with someone who's on both sides, right? They know you as an instructor, they're in the class, then they also see what students are having difficulties and challenges with, and they're able to help bridge those things. So it actually causes this really great synergy between faculty and students to get kind of insider information, not the confidential stuff, but just in general, like, well, students were really asking about this. Oh, okay, I didn't know they weren't getting it. Okay, let's talk about that. And so students also hopefully participate more when they come back. Benefits for leaders, I just kind of talked about that. I'm going to breeze past that, but there are many benefits for SI leaders, including having those closer relationships that actually can be a resume booster as well for them. Benefits for institutions. Again, hopefully you're seeing this as an institution that's doing the things it's set out to do, and is a more cost-effective model than some other models are. I am not walking through like super diligently every one of these charts, but let me just explain what we're looking at, and then you can go from here. Susan, I cannot forget to send you this. But these are percentage of DFW final course grades. And these data that I'm showing you in these charts, I know it's a lot to probably try to read on this small screen, but what I'm showing you is aggregate data from our accredited institutions so that we know that these institutions are running an SI program with fidelity. A lot of places have SI, but it may not be SI that we would call SI, right? So this is actually, and it's at the bottom here, 37 institutions representing 3,123 courses and nearly 400,000 students, so 387,000 plus students. But just to look at, and we didn't have any 2-year private accredited, and we still don't actually have any 2-year private accredited institutions in our system, but you're looking at student performance. These are students who participated in 1 to 4 sessions of SI. The yellow are students who participated in 5 to 9. We've got the green, which is 10 or more. That's a sweet spot, right? That'd be great when we could get students to attend 10 or more sessions in a term. And then these last 2 are just your overall. So the blue represents like even 1 session of SI compared to none. And the red represents they did not attend any SI sessions. So in general, when we're looking at DFW rate, we want to see that be low. So you can easily see that, yeah, when students attend 10 or more sessions, yeah, that's our lowest rate, but we're getting pretty good bang for our buck when they attend 5 to 9, et cetera. So it is working. And we can easily look at these last 2. Let's see, you are a two-year public. So this is the one you want to focus on probably. Easily look at this last one to see, okay, did they attend any SI compared to not, and see that rate is definitely lower. And again, you will find anomalies in this. Again, I'm not going to go through every single, I just want to make sure you know what's here so that you can look at it later. This is separated by discipline. So that was overall. This is by business, health and med, humanities, natural science, social science, math, computer, and other. So you can see by discipline, and usually computer is one that doesn't, this actually yielded. A lot of times when we look at data at an institutional level, the computer classes, SI it's an interesting fit sometimes. Lots of theories about why that is, but sometimes we'll see that computer classes, maybe group study doesn't work well for many of those students. Actually, overall it does when we look at our data here. So you can look at that by course. This is mean final course grade, so a little bit different data, looking at those overall mean GPAs, and that's by discipline. So DFW by discipline, again, not going to spend a lot of time. I want you to be able to look at these a little bit later. And then final grades by discipline. And then just to see what was represented in that sample, the largest portion is natural sciences. When you heard the story of Deanna Martin and UMKC and how that all started, you heard that it really started in health and med. So natural sciences has still prevailed as the highest percentage that we have in our data set, followed closely by math. But the purpose of this is to not only let you see what's represented in the data, but to let you understand that SI can be for any course. Sometimes you might have to modify a bit or kind of figure out how does that look for a humanities course, or what does it look like in English, but it can be done and has been done across the country and around the world. We don't always know, is SI or is this intervention what's making the difference? And to narrow this variable, isolate the variable is a very hard thing to do in any research, but particularly social science research. We actually at UMKC had for a time, and I think we no longer have this program, unfortunately, but it's a specific program, and we're not saying to go purchase this, but it's called Civitas Illum. This particular program had a little black box inside of it in which it could keep an ongoing record of students' persistence, or their predicted persistence rate for every student and all of their demographics. The little Civitas Illum black box knew what that student's predicted persistence rate was, which was very helpful when we went to study SI. So in 2016-17, when I first came to the International Center from other work that I had done at UMKC, we got involved in this, and we had a large study done of SI on our campus. We paired like students with those who were like them, those who had attended SI and those who had not. And we were able to match them not only on their key demographics that you would typically think about, race, gender, ethnicity, et cetera, but also their past prediction score. Remember that little black box that it has, which knows the prediction of their retention. And this is a little bit challenging to take a look at, but just to let you know, what we found is that when we matched these students, they had almost identical prediction percentages, because that was one of the key things, is to match them on what they were they expected to persist. That was almost identical when we started. The students who attended 3 or more sessions ended up here compared to those who attended 2 or fewer. So there was a 7.8% persistence lift that we could then attribute just to them attending SI. It was pretty groundbreaking for our institution. Specifically, and I know this was of interest to you, how did students who were low achievers, first-time college, our Black African-American population, we did not have enough people of color and other categories to include them here, unfortunately, but we did have enough Black students to be able to take a look at how that was working. So you can see the lift in persistence here for all of these pairs based on their participation in SI. This is an incredible lift. Just to put it in perspective, the company, Civitas, when we took this data back to them, most interventions that are highly successful have like a 2% lift. We on our campus were having a 14% lift in the difference between students attending SI and not. So it was really incredible. That led then also to a return on investment. We could actually calculate if we had more students attending SI, we can actually see what that would yield to the university in terms of tuition. And so we found out that we, in annually, 2 terms, $590,000 because of SI. Now, unfortunately, our institution did not hand us $590,000 because we had saved them $590,000. But nonetheless, we knew that we were making a difference there. We do train, as we talked about earlier, the International Center trains now around the world routinely because folks are able to join online. So we've trained folks from, it's actually 34 different countries at this point, if not more than that. Those are the countries that we've trained participants directly from the center, and also have an international network. So these are national centers in other countries so that we can definitely proliferate the model of SI that we know is so effective. And the last thing I have to show you is our 3 little mice at the beginning of a term. These are 3 students and they're all looking at their syllabus and they're like, wow, that's gonna be tough. They get together in SI and that's how they solve their semester. So they're able to be successful in their course.
I just want to thank you for, and maybe would you come back and talk to us again and kind of where we can take off where we left off here. We have a little business to do, but I'll let you click your ruby slippers and go back to Kansas.
I just have to add my thanks to say how very much we've learned from your presentation. We've been validated by it because we do some of the things that you mentioned, and we also learn what we need to do. So I'm so appreciative. Thank you so much.
Well, I didn't state all of those goals, but if I had, you just made me the happiest person ever. So thank you so much for having me, and you all have a great rest of the meeting and a great rest of the day.
Thank you so much.
We owe you.
Bye.
See you soon. Bye
Great.
now.
Bye.
Thank you. It was great.